Andrea. Andrea, welcome.
Hi, no, thanks for having me.
That's great. All the technical issues, but they're all resolved. So how
Figured
are
it
you?
out.
Yeah,
I'm doing well. Yeah, how are you doing?
Doing well. This is looking forward to your conversation. We had two great speakers so far, Bryson and Wendy. Of course, Wendy always delivers.
I know that that's a hard act to follow, both of them.
Yeah, no, everyone says that, and that I feel bad for Eric who comes after you. So, but I know Eric is going to kick some butt here. So, Andrea, what's your presentation going to be about?
Yeah, I'm going to address some trends this year that we've seen, both in data protection and data at risk. So, sort of the competing spectrum that's going on across the globe, and then look ahead to next year, see what we may be expecting. So
Yeah,
it's only a few days away.
Yeah, I cannot believe this thing. Yeah, exactly. Just 16 more days, and then we're in 2022, 2023, 2022.
It's like 2020 plus, however many days, really.
Whatever.
It's all just mushed together at this point.
It's funny. It's funny. All right. Well, you are co-host, so you can share the screen.
Let me get that going. And then, all right. Are you seeing the full screen? Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Andrea.
Well, great. No, thank you. Yeah. And, please feel free to ask questions throughout. Happy to take some, but yeah, we'll dive in for pretty much the first half, talking about what's going on across the globe and data protection and data at risk, integrate some of the new trends that we're seeing, and then also look ahead at where we see some of those trends are going, and then also what to expect in 2022, perhaps a little bit of a crystal ball. And so to start off, and there's a quote that I had come across basically from the UK's head of intelligence, that if you allow another country to gain access to really critical data about your society, over time, that will erode your sovereignty. You no longer have control over that data. And I thought it was interesting hearing this. This was one of his first public remarks. And within this commentary, that he basically coined this notion of the data trap and avoiding the data trap. And I really like that framing of it, because that is really what we're seeing going on across the globe. And it's in a way that I haven't heard many government officials talk about yet. And I think it's something that corporations also aren't necessarily considering quite yet, just what's going on as far as the regulatory environment and how governments are further, in many cases, eroding protections for data, while others at the same time are actually enhancing some of those protections. So that's really sort of the two ends of the spectrum that we're seeing, and that's what we'll be talking about a bit today. And within that, it really falls up into this broader context of what I think of as a battle for information control, because it really is. We're seeing these competing techno ideologies popping up across the globe, and it's having just enormous implications. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that's really going to affect every aspect of society, depending on how both the regulations occur on data protection and data privacy, but really is just shaping the future of the internet, which I think, as everyone has realizes now, touches every aspect of our lives. And so we'll first, talk a little bit about those ideologies, sort of a refresher on those. I know I've talked about those a little bit here and there, both at previous Tactical Edge and then also in some other conferences. But just a reminder for what those different techno ideologies are, how they manifest in their different tactics and techniques and procedures, and then also start looking ahead into 2022. What we just said was only a few weeks away, which is just mind-blowing for me, at least. And one thing I wanted to take a step back and think about, why are we seeing these techno ideologies, this diffusion and divergence really starting to occur across the globe? And it really is starting to changing how we think about data and data as a source of power. And this is just a little bit that I want to do just a quick background on first. I think it's just really important to start thinking about data in different ways than we have generally in the past. This was a cover of an Economist a while ago, really talking about much more so on the social media side. And so that is one aspect of it. But it really is data writ large is becoming the most valuable resource, and protecting it as well becomes extraordinarily critical, I think, as this audience knows all too well. But what it also is doing is changing the nature of power. And so my background originally was in working in the Department of Defense, and before that in academia, really focusing on the integration of technology and democratic institutions and economic flows along the lines of how they shape power. And power used to be, for quite some time, and really until I say maybe even just a decade ago, was focused on very traditional means of military personnel spending, iron and steel production, those kind of things. But the internet and cybersecurity and emerging technology are completely shifting this on its head. And it's because it really requires very few resources to have a very, very big impact. And we've seen that for everywhere from the whole huge expansion of ransomware, which honestly, I'm not even going to actually be addressing in this, but it's because I do feel like it's actually something that's been going on year after year after year, and has plenty of experts to fully go into the weeds on those. But I think that's just a great example of how the shifting nature of power is enabling some smaller groups to have a very big and oversized impact. And so that's really shifting how governments then are treating power, because they are treating data, because data becomes a source of power, both for, and it's also something that for national governments becomes that source of power, but then for organizations and corporations, it really must be treated as an asset. And that is, again, what many, I think, more forward-leaning ones have for quite some time thought about data as an asset. And there are still some that really aren't quite catching on to that yet. And so we need to help pull them together, because I think, as I think you guys were talking a little bit before about supply chains, all of us are only as strong as the weakest link within our networks. And so we need to ensure that everyone across our networks fully understands just the necessity for protecting data for a whole range of financial, reputational, and then even in many cases could be existential implications for organizations. And that's why sort of mastering how the speed of the data, the volume, the variety, and veracity becomes important, but on top of that, really protecting it. And so that's just a little bit of a background on why this is really starting to shift and why we're seeing the various governments lean one way or another, because it is a source of power. And then for organizations, we're also seeing that in corporations, especially, it becomes really an essential asset to protect and to secure as they have a global footprint, or even if for those that don't have a global footprint, it becomes just essential and a top priority. And because there is such a critical role of data in power across the globe right now, and I think that's something that will continue for sure over the next few years, if not decades, what we're seeing is that there are different approaches to dealing with that data, and that data as a source of power. And on the one hand, we're seeing the digital authoritarians, and you probably also have heard them called techno dictators. And what the objective for under this auspice, and it really, what I'm painting here is sort of a broad picture. Many governments fall under some spectrum along these lines. So I'm basically highlighting sort of each ends of the spectrum. And so for digital authoritarianism, it's the use of various forms of technology by authoritarian regimes to survey, repress, manipulate the data. And for the most part, many of them started focusing first on their domestic audience, so on their own populations, but they've leveraged those lessons learned to then apply elsewhere. And we see that going on a lot. And that's why in many cases, several years ago when I would talk about this, I'd often get the question, well, why does that matter? It's basically, it stays localized within their borders, so it doesn't really impact those of us that don't live in those countries. And it does. And these kind of cases, that the means that they are using do spread across borders. So not only are certain governments then applying them to foreign populations, and I'd say sort of even the most recent example, we're already seeing instances of, in the US, of multiple governments basically building upon and spreading disinformation within the United States, and building upon our own domestic population's use of that as well. But we're also seeing copycats, and we're at a point where internet freedoms across the globe have been on the decline for over a decade. And so that is all part and parcel of the digital authoritarianism really starting to spread across the globe. So
hey, Andrea.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry to stop you.
No, go for it. Yep.
But the last bullet, it's very interesting to me because I had to read it like 2 or 3 times. Freedom of information threatens political survival.
Yes.
It used to be you switch the word information for speech, right? And now it's information. That's what caught my eye.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great point. And that's, absolutely. I mean, if you think about, in the pre-internet era, it was trying to suppress speech and suppress even just gatherings of groups, for instance. And now that's all really pertains to the broader umbrella of just any kind of information. And that's why it's, it's not just, disinformation, which can then lead to basically censoring any kind of legitimate information from surfacing up. Like that's just one form of censorship. But there also is just, blocking any kind of data from being, or information from surfacing. And that is really where we're seeing the whole range of tools and tactics being used, because for governments, at the end of the day, their biggest objective is to stay in power. And so to do so, very often this suppresses their political survival. And I think it's interesting right now that we're seeing this a lot popping up across the globe. I think even, in China, the most recent example of Peng Shui, the tennis player, and the whole censorship going on around there. But what's been interesting on that is that the Globe, and especially the Women's Tennis Association, has done a really interesting job actually highlighting that information and trying to push that information through. And they're finding, unique ways to actually, find cracks in the censorship to get that information out. But then, China and the government in return is still trying to suppress it a bit more, and and even leaking, various kinds of of disinformation and so forth, and trying to manipulate the information. So it is something for these digital authoritarians that's a threat to their political survival when the truth comes out about things. And it's not just instances among the leadership, although that certainly matters a lot. I think we see cases of when certain media do investigative reporting on the networks of certain corrupt leaders. They try and suppress that information from surfacing, and that really oftentimes is actually what sparks a lot of the protests. It's not necessarily certain policies, but it's exposure of very, very corrupt and wealthy practices that can undermine a lot of these authoritarians. So it's very interesting to see what they do to try and suppress that, which also is why, for them, democracy across the globe becomes a threat, because under democracies, again, in a pure form, there is that freedom of speech and there is that freedom of information that can surface up, and then that becomes a threat to their own political survival, because it can surface information that they don't necessarily want their own audiences to be aware of. I think that's a good point. And I would say, and along those lines, sort of what the opposite looks like. And again, I would say this is aspirational, and I think that's really important to highlight. I think, especially in the United States, we're having a lot of interesting challenges going on right now with our own democracy. But democracy across the globe continues to be a grand experiment. But the reason why that aspirational vision of creating something that is secure, open, trusted, and free is because we need to have, absent that kind of aspirational vision, these other more concrete and salient models are basically filling that void. And that's also what we've seen. So absent basically a strong democratic model for the internet, the authoritarian model has been enabled to flourish. And so we need to maintain and still continue to strive for an aspirational version of what we want the internet to be, that does ensure freedom of information as a universal right. The UN has mentioned that before in some of their documentation. And this is for sure, lagging behind, but we'll talk about some aspects of this down throughout the course of this presentation. But for them, if under the digital democracies, it really does require collaboration and cooperation. And these policies, laws, and norms are starting to emerge, but for quite some time, they really were quite absent. But I think we're starting to see some transition there, and we'll talk about that a little bit down the road. But how each of these manifests are in three big areas, and these are competing forces. And so I want to go through each of these competing forces that are going on, because I really do think they're impacting, basically for societies, they're very access to data, but for companies as well, it's really should help inform their data protection strategies. And so we'll go through both internet access at writ large, supply chains, and then some of the regulatory data access and protection shifts that are going on. And we'll start with the blackouts versus internet expansion, because this really, at its most basic form, is, can you have access to data? And that, in some cases, depending on where you're sitting right now, that may seem obvious. Well, we have very easy access to the internet. It's not true across the globe, for sure. And so just one quick example, very often what we're seeing from the digital authoritarians are internet blackouts. So completely crushing any access to the internet. And it largely happens around protest. So again, that back to the notion that Ed brought up as far as access to information as being a threat to their regime legitimacy. This is what we're seeing. And so following the coup in Sudan, there was an internet blackout. Saw the same thing happen in Myanmar earlier in the year. And this is just something that we see a lot, is that when there's underlying protests, Iran has had this happen a couple of times, actually. We start seeing more and more targeted internet blackouts by the government. A few weeks after the coup, the judge ordered the end to the blackout. It still has been kind of chaotic back and forth on that. And what we're seeing is that this is really just part of a broader trend where, out of the nearly 850 shutdowns that we've seen over the last 10 years, the majority of those have happened in the last 5. And we continue to see that number continue to grow. More and more organizations, our governments are starting to employ this tactic. And looking at some of the pace of that change, we see the percentage is increasing significantly. And why this matters, it's not just something that is societal and impacts, at the basic level, democracy and political institutions. For corporations, it does become very important. It costs the global economy billions of dollars every year due to these internet blackouts. And so we do continue to see this trend. Over the first half of this year, there have been at least 50 across 20 countries. And it's important to note that's not just the authoritarian regimes. And how I alluded to that, what happens in the authoritarian regimes, it does get adopted elsewhere. And some of their tactics do get adopted by democracies. India has had one of the longest internet blackouts in history, over 200 days in the Kashmir region. So it is one of those things where governments see other governments successfully blocking that freedom of information, and they want to do it as well in certain areas of their country. Most recently, what we saw just in November was an Indonesian court ruling in favor of blocking the internet to squash social unrest. So that again is an example of huge population, one of the largest democracies, blocking the internet to squash access to information during social unrest. So it is a troubling trend that we're seeing, and I do think it's something that corporations need to be very much aware of, especially if you've got a global supply chain, and if it happens to be in an area that does get a blackout, that can really, really cause a disruption across your business. And this is just some of the costs, country to country for 2020. Again, you see Turkey in there, India, as well as many of the more authoritarian regimes that are out there. So it does cross that spectrum that I've been talking about, from digital authoritarianism to digital democracies. Many of those fall under digital authoritarians, and some are kind of in the middle, but leaning more and more into the authoritarian realm. But fortunately, what we're seeing as well at the same time as these blackouts, we're actually seeing a great internet expansion. So in each of these cases, they're orthogonal forces that are completely going in opposite directions. And this is just, I think, an interesting map of Venezuela during some of their internet blackouts, which Venezuela's regime has deployed this method several times as well. And so when looking at, on the positive, as an internet accelerator, COVID-19 obviously has been horrific and has been one of the biggest disruptions, I think, in our lifetime. What it has done in many cases has accelerated underlying trends that were already there. And one of these trends that has accelerated was access to the internet. And so the internet user ranks grew by 4 billion since 2019. And so if you think about that, that's twice the population of the United States. So it's a pretty large number of people who now have access to the internet who did not in the before times before the pandemic. So that alone, I think, is amazing. But there still are billions of people who have never used the internet. And that becomes a problem because in an era of digital literacy and of basically the digital revolution that is still very well underway, those who are excluded from that revolution have greater poverty, there's greater illiteracy, and they also just, access to basic basic services like electricity are much less. And so not only on, because of the ability to, for access to business and so forth, but really you see there are huge economic benefits for digital inclusion. And so that's why it's so important to continue to expand digital and internet access to those billions of people who still have yet to hop online. And that's going to have a huge impact. And what we're seeing really are some really interesting projects starting to pop up to expand the internet into rural areas. And some are using satellite internet projects. There's one project I've come across, a Stranis deal, to bring internet access to 3 million people in Peru by 2030. Viasat has a similar project across the entire area of Latin America. Oh, go on.
I'm sorry, Andrea. Yeah, because I have a question here.
Yeah.
So if you can go to the previous slide, because I like that slide. Yeah, that one.
Yeah, it's a little blurry, sorry.
No. But I like, because it tells a story. So it's countries that are more interested in increasing the digital inclusion. And if they are, then why, if the previous examples show that it is the countries that are the ones that are fighting against? So it's like, against access to information. So it's kind of weird. I
know. Yeah, these are opposing forces that are going on. And I would say in many of these cases, those that are doing the blackouts are not necessarily the ones that are doing the internet access. So you'll still see there are plenty of areas across the globe that, like in Sudan, probably is not the government that's pushing for internet access, but you very well could see that along the lines of like somewhere like perhaps Botswana, where there's still plenty of folks that do not have internet access.
Okay.
And so it's just we're really looking across the globe. That I'd argue, if you look in the lower left hand, that's still where we're going to see more of the countries doing the blackouts.
Okay, that's got my eye.
Yeah, but I mean, it is, and that's where I think a lot of us that work in technology, focus very much so on some of the, especially right now, on what's going on with the internet on fire. But there are just enormous societal implications for all aspects of digital access, and so one of them really is that economic growth. And then you're thinking from a corporate lens, that's in business's best interest as well, because when there's GDP per capita, that means there's more money coming in, which means there's more opportunities for businesses. And so it's a virtuous cycle that we should try and continue. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of innovation. But it is for sure that those companies, our countries in the bottom left there, really are the ones probably still doing a lot of internet blackouts.
Okay, perfect. And we're going to assume that a lot of those red points are smartphones, correct? Usually not going to be desktops or.
No, and that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of leapfrogging going on where sort of leaping over sort of what we had perhaps 5-10 years ago, which just doesn't make sense to recreate something that in the United States, at least, we're already trying to replace a lot of our outdated infrastructure. Right. So they're learning from that and using much more on the smartphones than on, certainly not on a desktop, and and then a laptop's really not as much as at all. And we'll see what comes after the smartphone.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Maybe the metaverse is next, is where we'll start seeing.
Well, that's another story with privacy and yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah, that's a big issue. But actually, and to that point, that's where a lot of mobile providers are really focused on extending this access to the point where in Africa, many of them waived fees during COVID to ensure that access is there. And so I think many of these of the infrastructure components are there, especially on the private sector side, to really help push and expand internet access. And so I think this is a good news story. We're seeing the human rights adopting internet access as a human right, and very often we talk a lot about governments saying some of these policies, but where we really do see, I think, and the audience knows, that the private sector is just such a core component, both of the innovation, but also not only as the recipient and target of many of the attacks, but also the ones responsible for actually helping provide a lot of the innovation and expanding the access to the internet. And so I think this is a story that often gets lost, amidst all the other news that does, also needs to have an impact as far as some of the more the negative and the latest attacks and so forth. But we're also really seeing an opening up to even more people across the globe to internet access, and ideally see with that greater development and greater movement out of poverty. And so with that, that's the one. Blackouts on the one hand, internet expansion going on, and that's something that's happened throughout 2021. Well, I think we'll see again in 2022. We're also seeing in the supply chain area just an enormous growth in manipulation, but we're also seeing the opposite of that towards collective resilience. And so we'll start first with the manipulation. And I would argue, this has been the year that supply chain attacks have really gained prominence. SolarWinds, about a year ago, and really from that time helped elevate the discussion to understanding what are supply chain attacks. But it's important to note, it wasn't the first one by any stretch. NotPetya was one as well. And so it's not something that's necessarily new to our community, but it was one that really did help raise the discussion on how these vulnerabilities can emerge through various kinds of connections across corporations and technologies. And what's often lost is, what is a supply chain attack? Because it's kind of a vague notion. It's not quite as well defined as some of these other attack vectors. And so this is from MITRE. MITRE does a great job as far as laying out the techniques. And it really runs a very broad range of what falls under a supply chain attack according to MITRE's tactics. One is the manipulation of development tools. We're also seeing manipulation of source code. We're seeing updates get manipulated. We saw it with CCleaner attack a few years ago. Even compromising a media can become a supply chain attack. Legitimate software can be, with modified versions, can be a supply chain attack. Then, then counterfeit products. And this almost goes into more of like some of the hardware components, modified or counterfeit products, and shipping interdiction. And if you think about like those alone, like each one of these bullets really could be, requires its own defensive measures against them. And so it covers just an awful lot in an area that has been a bit underexplored, but just given the nature of both our technological dependencies across the globe, and then as well as just the business and financial dependencies, it becomes really, really important to be able to look at it from a holistic version, because the attackers are, and the attackers are looking across all of these and seeing where they can find an easy way to find their way into a system. And over this course of the year, they've been up about 650%. I think last year the number was up about 400%. So it really is increasing exponentially. And that was before Log4j vulnerability. And we know that's being exploited right now in the wild. Everyone's moving very fast to try and patch that. And so more to come on that. But with all of that going on, what the nice thing is that I think it has actually sparked a need and an understanding that what we've been doing in the past isn't working. Everyone going at it on their own, alone, despite the interdependent nature of our global economy and our technologies, really does require an all hands on deck and a communicative focus to really try and push back against this. And so we've heard a lot over the last year over trusted networks, this notion of trust through collaboration. And it really, we can break it down to people, processes, and technology. Where we're seeing it on the side of people is just the deliberate inclusion or exclusion of different people or organizations or products from a supply chain. And we'll talk about, give some examples of each of these, but what you see a lot is through regulatory action prohibiting either people or their organizations from being within a supply chain because they pose a security risk. On the area of processes, we're seeing some new alliances and partnerships popping up. We're seeing some vendor compliance and security screening and actually assistance across that from across the supply chain. So those that may have more resources are working with their suppliers to help them meet various compliance and security screening, especially if it's for an important supplier. They're understanding that if they're not meeting security screening and they really need that supplier, the organizations that do have some of the resources may assist in that area. And there have been some interesting cases of that, such as one organization helping provide the red teaming for a supplier. And so it's that kind of collaboration, I think, that we haven't seen a ton in previous years that really starting to pop up. And the software bill of materials, I think, is going to really also start forcing companies to have a better idea of exactly what software, what libraries, what products are they dependent on and are integrated within their systems. And then the area of technology, we're seeing the deliberate inclusion or exclusion of technology, and that's very similar to the bullet on the people. It's excluding certain technology that is deemed a risk from being in supply chains, and it's deemed a risk for either because it has very weak security or because the risk that it's manipulated and can provide perhaps a surveillance mechanism, for instance. But we're also seeing joint research and development across governments and private sectors and across private sectors as well, to create some more community-focused efforts to provide greater defenses. And then we're seeing some secure software initiatives. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of these. And so the first is looking at ecosystem effects. And this is where we see more and more companies starting to push out and provide open source means to assess and identify vulnerabilities before they become a problem. So basically working on helping defenders identify where they may be to get them patched. OpenSSF is another one where we're trying to secure all open source supply chains and advance open source security for everyone. And I include the links on these for folks that may want to go and learn more about them. Google and Red Hat and some other IT leaders now under the Linux are pursuing an effort called SigStore, looking for ways to standardize how to verify and how to protect software. And then Salsa is focusing on artifact integrity across the supply chain. And so each of these efforts really are forces pushed together from the private sector and from the technology community to address some of these shortcomings that we've seen so far. And I'd say several years ago, wasn't necessarily as high of a priority. Now we're seeing more and more of these efforts on collaboration to try and make both open source libraries and so forth much more secure, but also creating new processes for verifying that certain software has not been manipulated. And I think we'll see a lot more coming in this space over the next year.
We were just told that there's also GetBomb.
Oh, what's that?
GetBomb, B-O-M, as well in there. So.
Oh, yep. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, it is, and that's why they're keeping more. And I think this is, again, I think for developers, really some good use resources to use. And it gets back to the notion of really baking in security, and that's where a lot of development processes are starting to focus on in that area. I'd say not nearly as much as we need to, but it's a start.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's a start. Yeah,
it's a start. And honestly, again, with what's going on right now, I mean, we really do need to help recognize and lean on these efforts that are underway, because I don't think a lot of people are very well aware of all of them. And the more that we can raise awareness in this area, the more organizations across the globe can benefit from it, but also contribute. And that, again, is sort of the mantra of the open source is really bringing in all the great ideas from across the globe to help elevate and raise the bar for all of us. On the larger, more product and corporate size, as far as trusted networks, we are seeing just a huge employment of industrial policy to push back on some of those products and companies that are deemed security risks. And this is really increasingly a global effort that we're seeing, largely focused on Chinese tech companies that work in either the surveillance space, AI space, or other kinds of technologies, mobile phones and so forth. Those who work in 5G has become something that we're seeing a lot across the globe. If you look at just the US alone, has banned I think we're up about 360, 370 different Chinese companies from their supply chains. And I'd say at least half, if not more, are technology companies, folk that they're trying, that with a reason for the banning is for security risks and to build trusted networks. And that's just something that I think we're going to keep seeing more and more. And I'll talk about some of that as far as the future trends, but it really does impact what companies and what products can be within a supply chain, and then who those companies can then do business with. So that's, again, something that is a continuing trend. It's going on across the globe, and more to come on that. And then finally, I'm going to get into briefly the data access and data protection. And these, again, are just very divergent forces that are going on. And it's just, in many cases, there's some countries that are actually pursuing both at the same time, which we'll see how that ends up panning out. And so on the one hand, the data access, and this very much so falls under what the digital authoritarian belief in trying to gather and control the data as much as possible. And part of it also, those falls under the crypto wars. And so we're yet again hearing discussions about encryption and providing backdoors and so forth. And that just seems like it's a conversation that just comes up every few years. But even Australia required access to encryption keys, and so it's not just the authoritarians. Source code disclosure. This again is something for developers that should be on their radar. Certain, if doing business in certain countries can require source code disclosure. There are data residency risks, and so what that means is requiring data to be stored in a certain country. And so if that, if you're doing business in one of those countries that has a data residency law that requires the storage there, that should, at a minimum, inform data minimalization strategies, because that data can become much more at risk depending on which country it is in. There's also just a huge growth in surveillance and tech infrastructure across the globe. And then data access requirements, which literally does mandate access to data if asked, and doesn't have to be. Very often it's under the auspices of national security, but really, for many of these governments, they can make up whatever the national security reason is and require data access. And that is something that we're seeing more and more. China has started that, despite the fact that, and we'll talk about, despite the fact they have a data protection law, they also require data access.
Andrea, what do you mean by crypto wars?
Oh yeah, so for I'd say decades at this point, there's, and especially among democracies, there's a push to roll back encryption. So on the one hand, So on the one hand, it's there are regulations that require, like GDPR. You need to show evidence of showing good security procedures, including encryption. And then on the other hand, you've got Australia and the Five Eyes intelligence community, which are U.S. and some of its allies, are pushing back, basically wanting to require government access to encrypted data, with a court order, with digital oversight and those kind of things. And so, like providing access to encrypted data on the Apple iPhone and so forth. But it always under national auspices, and you get the battle. I mean, it's a both intellectual and technological battle where everyone in the security community almost, I'd say probably 100, may not be 100% because that's all impossible to get to, but majority of the security community across the globe, knows encryption as a great way to protect data. And then you've got the governments basically saying, okay, that's fine, except we want a backdoor access to it. And so that it's those discussions that go back and forth. That backdoor for one means that others can get into it, and just kind of goes back and forth. And at least in the US hasn't made any progress, but in Australia it did about 2 years ago. They passed the law that requires companies that are based in Australia to turn over data if asked by the government.
Wow. All right.
So yep. So I will say, at least in the US, it's been a little bit quieter on that, but I don't want to jinx it.
By the way, just a quick note about Australia. I just read it a couple of days ago. There's 15 kangaroos for every Uruguayan. So if the kangaroos attack Uruguay, it'll be a DDoS there. So just FYI of that. Nothing to do with this, but anyway.
But very useful information that I'm going to put into my next presentation. So I like that. And I want to know what you're reading where you come across these fun tidbits. But so along the lines of China's privacy law, like I said, so they do have a law that just came into effect November 1. This is actually a pretty big event for anyone working or has supply chains that extend into China. And so the focus on it, though, it sounds a lot like Europe's GDPR, with a focus on data protection officers, fines for breaches. You have to respond to individual data requests. So it's really focused on protection. It does continue a series of other laws that focused on data must be stored in the country. And on many levels, it sounds, for those of us in favor of data protection and data privacy, it sounds great, but it doesn't mention anything about blocking government access to data. And what the laws in China have continued to reinforce is that increasingly, the government can ask private sector companies for data if they want to. And while there's some vague language around the lines of national security interests, or if it concerns the interests of their population, at the end of the day, there's just no guarantee that your data would be protected against that kind of access. So that's a little bit worrisome. And what I think is also sort of an interesting tidbit is that just the impact that this has not only on companies that are directly located in China, but it's actually had a really interesting impact on supply chains, because as we know, China is basically the supplier to the world still, really the core node of our supply chains across the globe. And with this data privacy law, there's something called the AIS data that tracks the cargo, and that data has basically, as you can see in the map, had a sharp decline. And so we're starting to lose some visibility to where some of the cargo ships go. And so just, I think for many people who follow this, it's whether it's I would consider it an unintended consequence. Maybe it wasn't intended, but for those working in supply chains, this is something that probably was not on the radar for something that would happen with a data privacy law. And yet this is where we are. So it's just, I think these data privacy laws and data access to, the sort of the hoarding of some of this data by governments really is going to just trickle out, I think, in different ways across economies than we may even have imagined previously. So that sounds a bit dire, but at the same time, we are seeing the counter trend going on with a big push towards data protection. And GDPR is the biggest one in Europe, and really is the one setting the stage for regulations across the globe. Brazil's recent law is based very much so on the GDPR, some differences, but inspired by it. In Africa, almost half the countries there have some form of a federal data protection law. It's great news. In the US, we still lag behind. We've got California's law. I'm in Virginia, where we just passed a law. And so we're basically getting a patchwork increasingly across the 50 states of some laws popping up. But there is this trend of across the globe towards greater data protection. And just in the last 6 months alone, we've seen Botswana implement theirs, Ecuador has enacted theirs, UAE, Brazil had an interesting approval of an amendment to the Constitution to look at data protection as a fundamental right. So I think that's an interesting thing, and we'll see if that catches on to other countries as well. And then Belarus, I think it's just a good example of both trends occurring, at the same time in one country. You see a new data privacy law passed, really focused on protecting personal data, consent and collection of that data, focused on liability for breaches and an oversight body. But at the same time, their oversight body also has a lot of control over the internet and internet access. And we're seeing just a huge spike in Belarus of restricting internet access. They're one of them that does internet blackouts, increase in surveillance, and also just leveraging what they're finding online for physical deadly force against some of the activists. And I think that's just a good example of where these two forces are coming into play in one country. And it just makes for, it's a lot of confusion for companies on what to expect going forward in this area. And so what I'd want to do is wrap up a little bit with looking at just a couple of the trends going forward. And on the one hand, all those that I just talked about, we'll continue seeing those. I don't imagine these coming together. I imagine we're actually seeing more and more of these two different, the three trends, and then each of the divergent trends within them. I think we're going to see more and more of those over the next year. Which means that, while on the one hand, malware, viruses can spread across the globe without really thinking about borders, but at the same time, for all of us, our experience on the internet is going to be different depending on where we sit. And I think for anyone who travels globally, you notice that. And I think that's just going to become more and more of an issue as these regulations and as these different behaviors and quests for data control and data protection continue. But also I think what's interesting is the notion of the privatization of the attacks. Spyware, I think, gained a lot of, not necessarily momentum, but a lot of visibility over the last year. And it's at the point where a lot of governments are purchasing privatized spyware to use against, very often it's against their own civilians, against activists, journalists, NGOs. For instance, NSO Group is the most prominent one that we're hearing a lot about, but they're just one of dozens of companies that are selling spyware or data extraction technologies to governments for use both against their own population, but also start off doing it against their own population and then goes against other populations as well. And I think what's interesting about this trend is that, so the NSO Group is one that creates a Pegasus spyware, and the US just recently added NSO Group to the export controls under commerce. But what we're seeing, and this is where some of the supply chain component comes into play with this, is that these groups aren't just unique islands. NSO Group is also known as Cyber Technologies, or could be a subsidiary of it. It's a little bit unclear, but they also have subsidiaries of their own and then investors of their own. And so when you think about just one company, it's really rarely just one company. They've got a whole string of relations. And so it just makes it very hard, and it's also very nebulous to understand or to see all the different players that are competing in the area of privatized spyware. And I think we're going to continue to see that be an issue. France was about to purchase NSO, the Pegasus spyware, before it became aware that it was actually used, that Pegasus spyware had been used against the French government. And that, again, it's for the contradictions of it, I think are enormous. We'll continue to see some more movement in that area. I do think we'll keep seeing some of the regulatory environment and information control is shifting, and this is just a couple examples. The change is just coming very, very fast. Very often we see technology outpacing policy, and that I think will always be the case, but policy really is trying to catch up, and it's catching up in very interesting ways where like Hungary, for instance, over the last year suspended some aspects of GDPR. And you've got other areas where, where we've got major big tech corporations in charge of so much data, and they're getting requests for access to the data, puts a lot of control under these corporations that are currently very well unregulated. What we're also going to see is this integration of cyber and human rights. And this is actually something that's been in the news over the last few days, but looking at the cyber and the human rights, sort of that intersection of the two, many of the tech companies that have been banned in the United States have been for human rights abuses. But it's not just in the United States. This is actually interesting that one of the members of parliament called this a uniquely Australian innovation, which I'm not sure it's necessarily true, but I think that I applaud that they want to focus on this, because it is, I think, something that will be increasingly important. And they just passed a new law that allows the government to ban any kind of technology companies who are engaging in human rights violations, but also who are implementing cyber attacks. And so there is going to be, I think it's partly in response to this privatization of cyber attacks, and also in response to technologies that are being used for enormous human rights violations across the globe. And so we'll continue seeing the banning of certain companies that are working at that intersection. And we're also going to see the splintering, of applications. And I think this is an interesting trend as well. So India permanently banned TikTok and hundreds of other Chinese apps for security concerns and concerns over both data access, but also you have various concerns over surveillance. In Russia created a domestic rival called Yappy, and that's what that icon is there, to replace TikTok, because TikTok refused to censor some of the anti-government posts that were being made. And so this is where, on the one hand, we kind of group Russia and China together in some of their information control techniques, but we should never assume that they're completely collaborating in this area. And this, I think, is a good example, because Russia wants to have control over what's going on in their environment. And I think what's interesting about Yappy is that's owned by Gazprom, which is a big oil and gas conglomerate. It's part of their research section. So I think that's just something interesting to continue to keep an eye on in that regard. And then China, most of what I've talked about so far has been some of the Western democracies blocking China, but China on its own also is creating its own industrial policy focused on domestic innovation, domestic companies, and building those up while kicking out some of any non-Chinese companies. And they kicked out 106 applications because they failed to match or further data practices, but for failing to adhere to the data standards that they expect. And some of those also, though, were Chinese companies. Didi, a ride-sharing app, and some other fairly well-known Chinese applications have been impacted by this, but also so have some of the big tech companies. So Yahoo, LinkedIn, and some other companies in the big tech area have just completely withdrawn from China due to this challenging data environment that they're finding there. So I think this, again, just even in your app store, you're starting to see how the splintering is going to impact what you have access to and why. We're also moving underwater for some of where this rivalry is continuously taking place. And again, back to the notion of information control, we're going to start seeing seeing already, and I think we'll see this in the news more next year, just a rivalry under undersea water cables and the information traveling there. Just in the last week, there are two, again, divergent headlines popping up about what China's building their own infrastructure. And then you see the US, Australia, and Japan working together to fund their undersea infrastructure. And something to keep an eye on. I think that's all I'll say with that one. More to come, but I absolutely think it's just an interesting area to focus on. And that even excludes some of the work that some of the big tech giants in the US are doing, and currently not terribly well regulated. And all that comes to the notion of collective resilience. And I talked about that a little bit, on the supply chain side, but we are seeing more and more on this. And I think we will see some really interesting areas of collaboration. And it's because of the market pressures that are out there. It's probably because of the threats. It's partly because of regulatory environment requirements that are out there. I think it really is taking all these different forces coming together to force greater collaboration. Again, I think this is the realization is starting to surface that trying to solve these enormous problems individually as a company, as a government, just isn't working. And some interesting things just in the last week or so, the Summit for Democracies that just convened. What we saw from that, we saw US, Australia, Denmark, and Norway agree to an export control tool, the use of export control tools, preventing those from within supply chains. So they're really trying to, this gets back to that notion of cyber and human rights coming together. But this is an interesting group coming together specifically with a focus on coordinating what technologies are banned from their supply chains as linked to human rights abuses. And I think that is something that I think this list will continue to grow for those that are signing on to this initiative. Another really interesting thing that happened over the last week was the IMF helped organize, along with 10 countries, a simulation of a cyber attack on a financial system. And on the one hand, it's like, well, you kind of think they would have done this before, but on the other hand, again, they focus on finance, and many focus on sort of their own area of the financial systems, and just that the knowledge has become just too prevalent that that everything is just so interdependent. It has to be a collaborative effect to see how our effort to really build better defenses and secure the global financial system. And so I imagine we'll see some more efforts like this, and they basically did a war game, to tabletop exercise to play out how a cyber attack would impact and how countries would respond. And I think that's a really great step. The more coordination we can have along these lines, the better ability we have to defend when and it's a when, not an if, these kind of attacks do happen. Just yesterday, you had a great new slide this morning. We're seeing the European Alliance for Industrial Data, Edge, and Cloud. It had existed before, but they had their first meeting with 39 confirmed companies being involved in it. Interestingly, the US and China were not among them. And so again, back to this notion of the splintering of different areas, this will be something to keep an eye on. This group is focused on really investing in secure and next-gen technologies together to raise the bar and to help provide greater security for those that are involved within the alliance. And then Log4j, and this is, we're seeing, Twitter's a great source for this, and these are some of the links on it, but just a whole list of products that may be have vulnerabilities that are exposed because of the Log4j vulnerability. And so the links are there. Because again, it gets to the point where, absent a software bill of materials, there really isn't some list that everyone can magically go to that lists where all these open source libraries are and what products. It just doesn't exist. And so you see this going on with CISA from the US, Netherlands as well, have been putting out a list of products that may be impacted. And I'd recommend you going to that list to see if you work in that area and work to track that progress. But I think that's, it popped up. I just think it's a really good example of a quick defender response. And I love on that tweet, defenders against Log4Shell, and it's defenders coming together, which I think is it's happened in the past, but I just really think we're gonna start seeing more and more of that, and I think it's a very welcome trend. And so as we go into 2022, we'll see these continued competing forces, we'll have disinformation and so forth, data protection going on in some areas, internet access going in other. So we'll continue to see those. What's really important, a lot of this has talked about countries across the globe, but they do have global reach. So many of them have extraterritorial components to them, which basically means that if those citizens are in your country, that data still has to be protected. And so similar to the GDPR, their data in Latin America, for instance, still needs to be protected the same way under GDPR rules. And we're seeing that more and more as far as data needs of citizens. Companies that have data on those citizens need to be treated as if they were following the government's federal data regulations from that country, which just leads to huge patchwork and something very hard to stay on top of. But we're going to increasingly be seeing that. And across all of these, I think hopefully I've driven this home very well, that all of these movements that are going on are really shaping the future of the internet, and we're seeing them in really divergent areas. And so I do think, and I sort of a call to action for all of us in this community to do what we can to help shape this future of the internet that is more secure and protected, and bringing the defenders together. And that's, I love that Ed has these conferences that do bring the defenders together in ways that we may not always get the opportunity to. And so these kind of forums are just essential for helping defenders unite against this broad range of threats that are out there. And just circling back to the beginning, I do love this notion of the data trap. Do kind of keep that in mind as you're thinking about your supply chain, where you might be vulnerable or exposed, and keep in mind what the various data practices and so forth are across the globe, so that you don't get caught in that data trap. And with that, I will wrap it up. But thank you, Ed.
Wow, this that raised a lot of thoughts and stuff like that. Our good friend Ryan English has a question. He's like, you mentioned Meta. Hold on, where did it go? Where did it go? There we go. You mentioned Meta, and his question was, what are your thoughts about the intersection of misinformation through social media like Facebook and the expansion of access in remote parts of the world? I mean, that's just going to continue.
Yeah. No, and that is where I just really, really hope that we can think about it a little bit better. I mean, on the one hand, we still haven't figured out really how to control it for areas where the internet has been around for a while. But I'd like to think that, so one, it'll be a concern there. And I think that's human nature. There'll be disinformation as the internet does expand. We do need to worry about that. The one area where I have some hope on that is that, you know, we're aware of that now. And so we can be more aware, and ideally, you know, we can start thinking about ways to offset that. And the disinformation, misinformation is an area that I think still, we don't have the solution to it yet. So, you know, perhaps going into, you know, with expansion of the internet, perhaps we'll have more people who actually have access to, you know, brand new ideas for how to solve this. And I think that would be great. I would love to see that happen. And we're going to start seeing, I think, innovative ideas from all areas of the globe. And so we shouldn't just assume that it'll be, you know, coming, actually, I can almost guarantee you it may not be coming from Silicon Valley, for instance, to solve that problem. You know, it may be coming from these areas that have not been exposed to the internet, and they may have a great way to start addressing it. And there was just an article on a company in Vermont that's starting up sort of a new collaborative effort for social media that does have a lot more rules to follow on that, but also means that there's a lot in, it's not the real time, there takes some moderation, but people are starting to hop on that because of not having to deal with some of the downside of the access to the internet and the disinformation and so forth. And so, you know, if that's just coming from an area in Vermont, I imagine that we'll see some interesting innovations coming from other areas of the globe.
Question from Andres Almanza. Do you think that the tendency to keep creating privacy regulations in countries could make it less achievable globally, given the conditions of each regulation? It's similar to what we're seeing in the States, where you have California and now you have Virginia. I mean, at some point there has to be one encompassing one. Well, does that make it difficult?
Yeah, I think I can't imagine having like a global data privacy law happen. I'm just even looking at how norms have failed so much at the United Nations, and norms are non-binding. And so even very basic norms as far as, you know, notifying on a data breach or not targeting critical infrastructure, that's been almost impossible to get through at the UN, just as a, you know, a voluntary adherence to it with absolutely no compliance mechanisms. So I don't think we're going to be moving towards a global data privacy law, and also because there's so many differences on how societies think about freedom of speech and so forth.
Yeah, so we had that conversation in one of the shows about culture is extremely important.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that's even something we want to aim toward, but like in the US, I would imagine, and I hope, I mean, so companies are just going to have an increasingly hard time dealing with the patchwork of data privacy laws in the US. So the US, I argue, you know, does need a data privacy law. And so, you know, maybe something that more regionally we can start seeing, like the EU having a regional, you know, some of the trade agreements are starting to have some data components to them. Okay. So like you know, NAFTA's new version is, and, you know, Mercosur could, you know, eventually as well. African Union is starting to integrate some cyber components to it. So that might be the way that we actually start seeing more coordinated policies, but it may not be at the global level. So it's interesting that you mentioned trade, because that has to do with monetary financial stuff, right? And the crypto market, it's pretty new. And when you hear all these conversations in the States about regulations, right? And actually last week, you had CEOs of some cryptocurrency companies appearing in Congress to talk about cryptocurrency. And you could see the Congress people, they didn't know what they were talking about. How can they create regulation for something that they don't understand? And then my next question on that one is that this morning, I read or I heard some of the leaders of some of these cryptocurrency exchanges and things like that, very young people, right? Very young. And they're like, okay, boomer, we don't drive, you know, we don't do our life based on regulation, right? We do it based on access to financial freedom, because that's their rallying point, just like data privacy, human rights is, you know, how do you see all this, you know, fighting and too many regulations? How do you see one leading and you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. I mean, so intergenerationally, that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And I do think that, you know, despite the sort of the anarchist tendencies, perhaps of the youth, which we all went through. There are going to be some regulations, but what I would hope is that, especially for something like cryptocurrency, where it is hard for more policymakers to actually understand. I mean, I think that's where the private sector really, and academia needs to really get involved and help educate. So either by working together with some of their staff, or through other kinds of, also going to what your Congress or Parliament and providing commentary on what can and should be done and what the implications are. And so I think very often we have a divide between the tech community and the political community, and the tech community really needs to even make a more concerted effort to help educate, as opposed to basically just calling them all boomers. I mean, that's the easy thing, right? Like we can, that's an easy solution. They're boomers, they'll never get it, and kind of walk away. That's easy. The hard thing to do is actually to work on helping educate them. And not all want to, so that's 100%. So, but for those that are open to it, work with them, do what you can. And there are a lot of really interesting tech policy internships specifically aimed at Gen Z to bring them into the policy on the tech side. And so I think that's how we can also help bring that generation in.
Beautiful. Andrea, as always, thank you so much. I mean, the information just overblown. The graphics are amazing. Where do you get all those graphics from? You have somebody that just makes it for you, or what?
It's a place called Google. I Google image search. That's why none of those I can sell.
Never heard of them.
I cannot make any of them on my own. I'm horrible at it.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Let me see. There's one more question. Hold on. From Juan Marin. Let me just see it here. Independent of the sector to which the company belongs, the acceleration of digital transformation has made companies more aware of having a transversal cybersecurity strategy for the organization independent of the sector to which the company belongs. Okay, so that was just a statement, a comment. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Juan.
Yep, makes sense.
So Andrea, thank you so much. Really looking, nice to see you. And if I don't see you before the end of the year, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, but I know we'll be talking.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, happy holidays to everyone. Happy New Year. And let's all work on this together.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you. Bye.